Hello and welcome everyone, CoinHound here. Today we're going to be taking another deep dive into history and coins. Our focus this time around is going to be Westward Expansion and the American West. So we're going to be giving a little bit of background, a little bit of the historical context of the movement of Americans across the continent, a little bit of the story behind it, some of the key events, and we're also going to look at various coins and rounds that have been issued over the years to commemorate that westward expansion and to celebrate the American West. So that's where we're headed. If you are not a subscriber, I do humbly ask that you hit the subscribe button. That helps me out tremendously. If you enjoyed the video, please hit like. If you have any comments or thoughts to share, please put those in the comments section. And let's get to it here. So let's take a look at the story of Western expansion in United States history. And along the way, we'll take a look at some of the silver coins and silver rounds that have been produced to commemorate some of those key moments along the way. The story starts, of course, in the very early 1600s with the original colonization of North America by the British, with the setting up of colonies in Jamestown, Virginia, and then you had the creation of Plymouth and Boston in Massachusetts, and then they expanded outward from there. Now, from the very beginning, these American colonists looked inland. They looked westward. Visions of expansion are there from the start. This is going to basically be the beginning of an amazing and fascinating story, the American expansion to the west. Now, there is also an additional wrinkle to the story, that this land, as we all know, was not vacant land. It was inhabited by the original settlers, the Native Americans, the Indians. So inevitably, that story of Western expansion is going to be filled with tension and conflict between the American colonists and ultimately the Americans and those Native American tribes. From the Native American perspective, this story is a very tragic one. But that's not going to be the focus of this video. We're going to take a look at the Western expansion more from the perspective of those who were expanding across the country. And as I mentioned, we're going to try and take a look at some of the coins and rounds that are associated with this expansion. Now, one of the first key developments is the French and Indian War. It takes place from 1754 to 1763. It was basically a fight over land in the Ohio River Valley. The area in blue was French-controlled. The area in red was the British-controlled. And then there was tension and conflict where they came into contact with each other. French began to build a fort in the Ohio River Valley, basically on the site of where Pittsburgh is today. It was called Fort Duquesne. This angered the British colonists, particularly the Virginians, who had set their eyes on that land for settlement. The Virginia government decided to basically put together a militia and send it out to Fort Duquesne to inform the French that they needed to vacate the fort. They picked a young Virginian, 21 years of age, named George Washington, to lead that expedition through the wilderness out to Fort Duquesne. That interaction with the French didn't go very well. There ended up being a bit of a battle. George Washington's militia was on the losing side of that. And it is going to be the spark that kicks off a broader war between Britain and France. Now, that war is going to last a number of years. And when it was ultimately settled, the British were victorious, and the French would surrender their land in North America. And the British would basically now have control of the original 13 colonies, Canada, and all the land west to the Mississippi River. So the possessions of the British government in North America dramatically increased. Now, there is no American coinage that I've been able to track down. And if, as I'm going through these coins, if I'm missing something or you're aware of something that's out there that I didn't come across, let me know in the comments. That would be fine. So didn't come across anything from an American perspective. Canada, however, did issue a commemorative silver dollar in 2013 for what they call the 7 Years' War. That's their name for the French-Indian War. And it's pictured there on the screen. Looks like a pretty neat design. And so that's about all I was able to come across. Ultimately, the French-Indian War is going to be a turning point in the relationship between the British and the American colonists, because the British did rack up a lot of debt, and their measures to deal with that debt are going to end up angering the colonists. One of those first measures is going to be known as the Proclamation of 1763. Now, the Native Americans inland had a pretty good relationship with the French because the French had a very light footprint. They were basically there as traders. They weren't there in large numbers. The British, however, they were settlers. They were building settlements. They were taking land. And so when the British won the war, that alarmed many of the Native American tribes inland. So Pontiac, who was a prominent chief in the Midwest, organized a bunch of tribes together and basically began attacking British interest. And the last thing the British wanted was another war. So they passed this proclamation. The king issued this proclamation stating that the colonists could not settle inland. They couldn't settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now that's really going to upset the colonists because from their perspective, the whole point of the war was to gain control of that land so they could move into it and settle it. So that did not go over well at all. And to a large extent, they basically ignored the proclamation and continued moving west. When it comes to the Proclamation of 1763, nothing with respect to U.S. coinage, anything from the U.S. Mint that I could find related to that. And I didn't really expect it. It's not the most significant event. From my perspective, it is somewhat significant because it's kind of the first step down the road to the American Revolution in which the relationship between the two sides deteriorates. I did come across this silver medal, if you will, from the early 1970s for the Proclamation of 1763. Left side there is the obverse of the coin titled Proclamation Bars Colonists from Moving West, 1763, and then a little bit more detail on the backside. I wasn't able to track down the source of this medal, but it does look a lot like one of the Franklin Mint commemorative medals that were issued on all various types of topics of American history back in the 1970s. So if it is one of those medals, most of those were sterling silver. So if that's the case, this would be 0.925 purity of silver. Now, Thomas Jefferson is kind of the next key point in the story. He becomes president in 1801, serves through 1809. And even dating back to the American Revolution, Jefferson had grand visions for the country, for the United States. Part and parcel with that vision was an expansion westward. Jefferson's vision he referred to by the phrase Empire of Liberty. He envisioned the United States spreading an empire of liberty across the land all the way to the Pacific. That the U.S. would spread across the land and it would bring liberty and self-government and democracy with it. Now, Thomas Jefferson is one of the best-known and most famous presidents. He has had a significant presence on American coins throughout the years, most specifically the nickel, which there's a few versions of the nickel on the screen there. And also in the presidential dollar series, he's the third president, so he was the third coin in that series, as is pictured there. Now, when it came to westward expansion, Jefferson's key contribution to that is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the Louisiana Purchase is an interesting story as to how it came about, because Jefferson wanted control of New Orleans. Basically, what happened was the land to the west of the Mississippi had been originally had been in Spanish hands, and then it changed over to French hands. Initially, Napoleon had visions of settlements and things in the New World, but they had some very bad experiences down in the Caribbean with uprisings and things like that, and Napoleon lost interest. And so basically, the Americans were in the right place at the right time. Jefferson sent over a delegation. He was concerned about maintaining control of maintaining access to the Mississippi River and access to the ports in New Orleans, and he wanted to buy that access from France. He sent over some delegation. I don't know the exact budget they had. I don't know if it was $7 or $8 million or something. And the French basically were like, well, not just New Orleans, how would you like all of Louisiana for $15 million? Now, they were in kind of a little bit of a spot there because they weren't able to just jump on the phone to Jefferson or telegraph him, if they were going to go home and ask for permission to buy this whole territory. It would be months before they could get back to France with the answer, and who knows if the offer would still stand at that point. So they just decided on the spot, let's make the deal. They did. They came home, and Jefferson had an interesting dilemma himself because he was a very strict constitutionalist. He believed that he only had the powers that were specifically laid out in the Constitution, and he decided, he was kind of torn. He wasn't sure if he had the authority to make the Louisiana Purchase. But I think the opportunity got the best of him, and he decided to plunge in and go ahead. He would present it to the Congress and get their approval, and he felt that if he got that, then that would be okay. And so it went forward, basically doubled the size of the country. There's a little quote on the screen there. Thomas Jefferson writing a letter in 1804 stated with respect to the Louisiana Purchase, quote, "I confess I look to this duplication of area for the extending of a government so free and economical as ours as a great achievement to the mass of happiness which is to ensue." The Louisiana Purchase, when it comes to American coinage, doesn't have a real significant presence, but there was a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase at an exposition, an international exposition that was held in St. Louis in 1904. And the U.S. Mint put forth a special gold coins for that occasion, a $1 gold coin in two different versions, which are pictured on screen there. One had Thomas Jefferson. The other one had the current president, William McKinley. Now, these are relatively small gold coins. They are just a smidge below or a smidge less than 1/20th of an ounce of gold. All right, but they do have a very significant numismatic value. Each coin, there was only 17,500 of each one minted, and from what I read, a number of those were turned back in and melted down at some point. So there's less than 17,500 of each in existence. And so you will pay a decent premium if you pick one up, but they are out there. You can track them down and get them if they capture your fancy. When it came to the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson was a man of many interests, a real Renaissance man, very interested in natural science, and he was very curious as to what was out there. What was out there to the west on the other side of the Mississippi River? And so he put together and authorized an expedition that would travel west and explore and record what was found, in some cases even sending back some samples of animals and plants and the like. It's come to be known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition because it was led by Meriwether Lewis and George Rogers Clark. The expedition went from 1804 to 1806. It was, I think, 33 men on the expedition. They were gone quite a long time. Miraculously, all of them except for one survived. And the one who died of, I think it was appendicitis. Quite an amazing story. They kept very extensive journals, and those journals have survived and are in print form, and you can order them and read them and get all the first-hand accounts of their adventure. I've always been fascinated by the Lewis and Clark expedition. To me, the thought of being on that expedition would be so incredible because they got to see the land as it was originally, without highways and buildings and skyscrapers and telephone poles and all that stuff. Traveling out west now is still pretty spectacular. There's tremendous beauty out there, but imagine it from Lewis and Clark's perspective. Yes, there were Native American tribes out there in the west, but they lived with a very light footprint on the land. So they were basically seeing the land as God made it. How incredible is that? Now, when it comes to coinage, the United States, for the 200th anniversary of the beginning of the Lewis and Clark expedition, did issue a silver dollar in 2004. You can see it pictured on your screen there. Also, the Sacagawea dollar is connected to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Many people know the story, but perhaps not everyone. Sacagawea was an Indian guide, a woman who Lewis and Clark connected up with along the way, and she joined their party and helped navigate their way through the various Native American tribes they encountered. And if I remember correctly, at one point she even saved those incredible journals when they fell into a river or something, and I don't remember the exact story, if she acted quickly and pulled them out or if she quickly alerted someone. But obviously she was a very key player in this expedition, and she is honored with that dollar coin. Now, this begins basically a decades-long westward expansion. And this westward expansion was honored, or maybe the better word would be commemorated, by the U.S. Mint through a special series of 5 nickels that were minted between 2004 to 2006. These are known as the Westward Journey nickels. Now, in 2004, the first of those nickels was issued, and it was commemorating the Louisiana Purchase. You can see a picture of it on the screen there. It has a handshake kind of signifying the agreement, I guess, between the French and the Americans. So that's a pretty neat coin there commemorating that event. The second of the nickels was a picture of the keel boat that the expedition initially took off with. I think it was up the Mississippi River. The Missouri River from St. Louis. So that was issued also in 2004. And then in 2005, there was a nickel with a buffalo on it, kind of a modern buffalo nickel, I guess. And that was sort of commemorating that tremendous natural attribute of the Great Plains, the buffalo, which is such a amazing part of that story of that region of the country at the time. And I think my numbers here on the screen are goofed up. It should be 2005 and 2006. The fourth coin in the series, I believe it was 2005, was a commemoration of the Lewis-Clark expedition reaching the Pacific Ocean. And it has a little inscription on there, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." And that was the words that were written into the journals. I can't remember if it was Lewis or Clark that wrote it. I think it was Clark. But that was their reaction to seeing the ocean. So it's an amazing story. You could very easily imagine a scenario where the expedition heads off and they're never heard from again and they all end up dying. But that didn't happen. They made it through to the Pacific, and then they were able to make their way back. And then the last of the series is a representation of Monticello, which was kind of the traditional reverse of the Jefferson nickel before the special series came into play. And I believe that was 2006, so a little correction to the screen there. Now, tied up with this Western expansion was an idea that emerged in the 1840s. It was known as Manifest Destiny. And the idea behind Manifest Destiny was, much as it says, that it was the destiny of the United States to expand westward to the Pacific Ocean. There was a religious element to that for many, that this was a destiny that was endowed by God, that was God's will. And it does tie back to that Empire of Liberty of Jefferson. So the idea here is expanding westward, bringing liberty, bringing democracy, bringing self-government with you. And this is a very famous picture, which I shouldn't say painting, called American Progress, which captures that idea. You see all the movement is to the left, to the west. You have Lady Liberty there floating along, and you see these settlers coming in after. You see trains in the background, because that's going to become a prominent part of expansion after the Civil War. She's carrying a telegraph line in her hand. That's going to be a key part as well. And a little bit of the picture's cut off on the left there, but the right side to the east is bright. The left side is dark, stormy clouds, and it represents bringing the light of civilization, of democracy, of self-government, of, liberty to the west. You also have a small grouping of Native Americans that are fleeing to the left too, in the face of this expansion. And just as a little side note there, you can imagine a very different painting of this expansion being done from a Native American perspective. So Manifest Destiny inspired many Americans, this idea of going west. There was a newspaper editor that coined the phrase, "Go west, young man." That was where you could find your fortune. That's where you could find your opportunity. The West was the realm of endless possibilities. And many people were attracted out there for that. Now, when it comes to Manifest Destiny, I didn't come across any particular official U.S. coins, but I did come across this silver medal. It was minted by Longines Wittnauer in 1972. It's a 1-ounce sterling silver medal. And on the right side there, you see the obverse. I just love that obverse. It's just awesome. Okay. And it has the expansion laid out in parcels, I guess you'd call it, of when various parts of land were obtained. So the 13 colonies out west to the Mississippi, you have 1783, which the Americans gained control of that land with the treaty ending the Revolution. Florida, 1819. 1803 is the Louisiana Purchase we just discussed. 1845 is going to be the annexation of Texas. 1848, you're going to add the Southwest after the Mexican War. A little bit additional land towards the bottom bought there in 1853. It's called the Gaston Purchase. And then a treaty with the British is going to give us the Oregon Territory up in 1846 there. So you see that all presented there on that obverse. Just a spectacular medal. I just love it. I really do. And then on the left side of the screen there, you see the reverse, which kind of gives a little bit of a description. During the 1840s, America was caught up in the dream of a free nation. Spanning the continent, by 1853, her manifest destiny was fulfilled. New land acquisitions extended the U.S. clear to the Pacific. Now, during this time of manifest destiny, it's also the time of the famous gold rush in California in the late 1840s. And there are some silver rounds out there that do reflect that time or commemorate that time. They're often referred to as prospector rounds. I've got a couple of them up on the screen here. You have a man panning for gold there on the left, and you have another panner, miner, on the right-hand side with his donkey. And so that was a trigger of westward expansion for sure, word of gold in the West. Many people went out there to seek their fortune. Some did get a fortune. Many more, perhaps most, came away with not much. So this is a $50 that was issued by the United States government in 1925. It was to celebrate California's Diamond Jubilee. Okay, and you have the panner seeking gold on the front side of the coin there, and then you have the bear, the symbol of California, on the back. So that's a pretty neat $50. Okay, 1862, you have the Homestead Act. Now, this was a big trigger of expansion. The U.S. wanted to get the West settled. It wanted to make that land productive, and the Homestead Act made that possible. Basically, anyone could head west and put a claim on 160 acres of land, and they would get that land for free as long as they stayed on the land for 5 years and worked the land for 5 years. If they did that, that land was theirs free and clear. All right, so that's a pretty amazing deal. And, I'd have to think that there are some farms and ranches out west today that probably originally were parceled out as part of this Homestead Act in 1862. Many people did head west. It was a very difficult life out there on the Great Plains. Very few trees, so they lived in sod houses. Very, very bad winters. Very hard work. Many people didn't prosper. They ended up going back east. But there were a hardy bunch that stayed. Okay. And they're kind of known as the pioneers in our popular thought. In U.S. coinage, the Homestead Act is commemorated on a quarter. And I suspect, and I probably should have confirmed this before the video, I suspect there's probably also one of those 5-ounce America the Beautiful rounds that commemorates the Homestead Act as well. This is basically for the state of Nebraska. They have the National Homestead Monument Site there in Nebraska, and that is commemorated on this dollar, and I suspect on the 5-ounce America the Beautiful round, although I didn't confirm that. Westward movement, of course, is going to result in continued tensions with Indians as the expansion continues past the Mississippi into what many of us would consider the West today. The ability of the Native Americans to retreat, to cede land and move westward begins to disappear because there's just no more land. And so this is going to cause a last flurry of conflict and fighting known as the Indian Wars throughout the 1860s, 1870s. And ultimately, the Native Americans are going to come up on the short end of those conflicts and are going to end up surrendering themselves to reservations. Perhaps the most famous moment of those Indian Wars, of course, was the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which George Custer, Union Army officer, found himself and his men basically surrounded by Indian warriors led by Sitting Bull, and he and his men were all massacred. Okay, and that location also is a national park site today. Now, when it comes to the Indian Wars, I didn't find any specific coins, but there are some silver rounds out there. There's a picture of a George Custer one. Not sure who the originator of this is, but it's a 1-ounce silver round. There's a number of Sitting Bull ones out there. Native American silver rounds are very popular, so it wouldn't take much work on eBay to track one of those down if you were interested. As I said, the expansion was westward. The land was beginning to run out, and basically you're going to get to a point where the West is settled. All right. And that's going to be officially declared to be the fact in the 1890 census. They're going to declare that the West has basically been settled and the frontier is closed. Now, there was a historian working at the time. His name was Frederick Jackson Turner, and he put forth a paper in which he laid out what was called his frontier thesis. And his basic idea was that the frontier basically shaped the American identity. All right. It shaped the American understanding of itself. Okay, so he issued this paper in 1893. What he basically said was that throughout all of American history, there had been a frontier in the West. And this was an area where life was difficult. You were living on the edge of the wilderness. You were facing the potential of Indian attacks. And he argued that this promoted and developed a sense of independence, a sense of individualism, and a sense of self-sufficiency amongst Americans. And that these character traits that were forged on the frontier permeated their way back to the East and influenced American culture as a whole. He felt that frontier life broke down class distinctions. If there was an Indian attack, the Indians didn't care if you were the wealthiest person in town or the poorest person in town. And so he felt that it broke down class distinctions and helped foster democratic values. And he also argued that it served as a safety valve to release discontent. So basically, up to this point, if you were an American and you were unhappy in your present circumstances, if you had failed economically, if you couldn't stand your family, if you got in trouble with the law, you could escape all that. All you had to do was go west, and you could start over and create a brand new life. And tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans did that. Now, the interesting thing was, what happens when the frontier closes? All right. And so Frederick Jackson Turner surmised that, the closing of the frontier was very significant because this tremendous influence that shaped American life and American identity, that interaction with the frontier wasn't going to be there anymore. Now, he and others proposed that perhaps new frontiers could be sought out. And this is going to help trip the U.S. or trigger the U.S. into an age of imperialism. Let's find our frontiers overseas. Let's engage in overseas conquest. With the closing of the frontier, even before the closing of the frontier, as the era of the West was coming into closure, Americans began to romanticize the West. This is where these ideas of cowboys and Indians and gunslingers and all this stuff, the Wild West, comes into being. Perhaps nothing personified this as much as the famous Wild West show of Buffalo Bill Cody. He had been a scout. He had been a Western adventurer, outdoorsman. And he created a Wild West show, which brought together people telling the story of the West, recreating wagon trains and battles with Indians, and even Sitting Bull himself appeared in some of the shows. The show was incredibly famous and successful. It went overseas. It went internationally and performed throughout Europe. And Buffalo Bill became one of the most famous men in the world. And of course, there's going to be silver that commemorates some of this time period. Perhaps the most significant silver rounds I came across were as a series produced by Intaglio Mint. But they have a Wild West series, and I have a picture of some of those rounds on the series here. Davy Crockett, Annie Oakley, Buffalo Bill, Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok, Billy the Kid. If you're familiar with any of those legends and stories from the Midwest, these were a lot of the key players. Annie Oakley, for example, was a famous sharpshooter who was a famous member of the traveling troupe of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. You also have some prospector rounds that have Western themes. These were put forth by Provident Metals. They were sold by Provident Metals, but they're made by the Highland Mint. And this one portrays a gunfighter. So you have that famous kind of imaginative, influential image of the Wild West and the gunfights at the center of the towns, marching off and turning and firing. So you have the gunslinger there. The other side of the coin, you have the hotel, the saloon, kind of the stereotypical storefronts of the Old West town. So it's kind of a really neat piece. I haven't seen one in person, but a really neat piece there. Okay, folks, so that's basically it for my discussion of westward expansion and the American West. Now, I should note, as the 20th century progressed, the idea of the West continued to captivate Americans, and the West became a very popular topic for movies in the emerging cinema business of the 20th century. The heyday for the American Western film was basically in the 1950s and into the 1960s, when it was arguably the most popular genre of filmmaking, both on the big screen and on television. So in my next video, which is in many ways a continuation of this video, I'm going to take a look at John Wayne, who emerged as the iconic representation of the American West, as the most popular movie actor in Westerns, and possibly, arguably, the best-known American actor of his generation. So that next video, which we'll be putting out here in a day or two, is going to basically continue this theme, look at how the West has been represented in movies, with a particular focus on John Wayne. I also will be discussing the brand new 2020 John Wayne 1-ounce silver coin that came out recently, which kind of sparked all my interest in this topic. So look out for that next video. In many ways, it'll be volume 2 of this topic, and I'll have that out shortly. So I thank you all very much. This was a longer video. If you've stuck with it through here, I really appreciate it. I hope you got as much out of it and learned as much and enjoyed it as much as I did in putting it together. Please, if you're not a subscriber, I humbly ask that you subscribe. Help me out in that area. If you liked it, hit the like button. If you have any thoughts to share, put them down in the comments section. And until next time, we'll see you later.